Elon Musk hears crying child in a park. His actions shock everyone watching. It was a serene afternoon in the park, the kind of day that invited people to take a break from their fast-paced lives and soak in the simple pleasures of nature. Parents strolled hand in hand, joggers weaved through pathways, and children laughed and played in the wide-open spaces. The rhythmic creak of swings blended with the distant buzz of conversations, creating a peaceful symphony. At the center of this idyllic scene, however, one sound pierced the tranquility, a child's sharp cries echoing from the playground. Heads turned toward the source of the commotion, their curiosity quickly giving way to discomfort. A boy, no older than 4, sat on a swing, his small hands gripping the chains tightly as he cried uncontrollably. His face was flushed, and his tear-filled eyes scanned the park desperately. People murmured among themselves, wondering where the boy's parents were. Some glanced around, hoping someone would step forward to address the situation. But as the minutes ticked by, no one moved. The discomfort turned into unease, and the once lively park seemed to hold its breath. Elon Musk had been seated on a nearby bench, blending into the crowd in his unassuming black suit. His schedule was packed, as always, but he had carved out this rare moment of quiet to clear his head. Yet, as the boy's cries grew louder, he couldn't ignore the tension building in the atmosphere. He looked up from his thoughts, his sharp eyes scanning the playground until they landed on the distressed child. The boy's cries were not just loud, they were raw, filled with fear and frustration. Musk's curiosity turned to concern. He stood, brushing off his pants, and began walking toward the playground, his steps deliberate yet unhurried. People whispered among themselves as they recognized him, their surprise at his presence momentarily overshadowing the unfolding drama. "Is that Elon Musk?" a woman asked her friend, nudging her shoulder. "What's he doing here?" another murmured. Elon reached the swing set, standing a few feet away from the boy. He crouched slightly, bringing himself to the child's level, his piercing gaze softening. The boy's cries faltered as he noticed the figure before him, though his small body continued to tremble. "Hey, buddy," Elon said, his voice calm and gentle. "What's going on? Are you okay?" The boy sniffled, his sobs slowing as he processed the question. He looked down, avoiding Elon's eyes. I can't find my mommy," he choked out, his small voice trembling with fear. Elon nodded, his expression empathetic. "That's scary, isn't it?" he said. "But don't worry, we'll figure it out together." "What's your name?" "Liam," the boy mumbled, his grip on the swing chains loosening slightly. "Hi, Liam," Elon said, offering a small smile. "I'm Elon. Can you tell me what your mommy looks like?" Before Liam could answer, a sharp voice cut through the air. "What are you doing?" Elon turned to see a woman in a crisp blazer approaching, her expression tight with suspicion. She was clutching a phone, her gaze darting between him and the boy. "Why are you talking to that child?" she demanded. Elon stood to his full height, his calm demeanor unchanged. "He's upset and looking for his mother," he explained. "I was just trying to help." The woman's eyes narrowed. "And who are you to get involved?" she asked, her tone accusatory. "People shouldn't just approach children they don't know. It's inappropriate." A few onlookers murmured in agreement, their unease shifting toward Elon. Others frowned, uncomfortable with the woman's tone. Elon remained composed, his gaze steady. "I understand your concern," he said evenly, "but this boy is clearly distressed, and someone needed to step in." The woman crossed her arms, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That's what park security is for," she said. "You shouldn't be interfering." Elon raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to Liam, crouching once more. "Liam, do you remember where you last saw your mommy?" he asked gently. Liam hesitated, his small fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "By the big tree," he whispered, pointing toward a distant oak tree near the edge of the park. Elon nodded, glancing toward the tree. "Okay, we'll go check there," he said. "But first, I want to make sure you're feeling a little better. Can you take a deep breath for me?" The woman in the blazer stepped forward, her frustration evident. "Are you even listening to me?" she snapped. "You have no right." "Ma'am," Elon interrupted, his tone firm but calm. "This isn't about rights. It's about doing the right thing. A child is scared and alone. Helping him should be everyone's priority." The woman faltered, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a response. Before she could find one, another voice spoke up. "He's right," an older man said, stepping forward from the crowd. "That boy needs help. If this man's willing to step up, let him." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The woman in the blazer huffed but stepped back, her indignation replaced by a begrudging silence. Elon turned back to Liam, his focus unwavering. "Liam, would you like me to walk with you to the big tree?" he asked. Liam hesitated before nodding, his tears slowing as he reached for Elon's hand. Elon took it gently, his large hand enveloping the boy's small one. Together, they began walking toward the oak tree, the crowd parting to let them pass. Behind them, the murmurs continued, some praising Elon's actions, others questioning whether he should have gotten involved at all. The woman in the blazer muttered something under her breath, but no one paid her any mind. As Elon and Liam reached the tree, the tension in the park seemed to ease, though the air remained charged with curiosity. People watched, their eyes following the unlikely pair, wondering what would happen next. Elon knelt beside Liam, scanning the area carefully. "Do you see her?" he asked. Liam's eyes darted around, his face lighting up as he pointed to a figure in the distance. "Mommy!" he cried, his voice breaking with relief. A woman emerged from behind the tree, her face pale with worry as she rushed toward them. "Liam!" she called, her voice trembling. As the mother and child embraced, tears streaming down both their faces, the crowd let out a collective sigh of relief. But the story was far from over. Tensions were about to escalate once again. As the boy's mother rushed forward to embrace her son, the tension in the air seemed to loosen for a brief moment. Tears streamed down her face as she held Liam tightly, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay. The scene was touching, even heartwarming, but it was clear the situation was far from resolved. Elon took a step back, giving them space, but his observant eyes remained fixed on the mother. She was visibly shaken, her disheveled appearance and trembling hands hinting at a deeper story. Just as he was about to ask if she was all right, the woman in the blazer reappeared, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she stormed over. "This is exactly why we have rules in this park," she exclaimed, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby onlookers. "Unsupervised children cause disruptions for everyone." The mother flinched at the accusation, her hold on Liam tightening. "I wasn't far," she said defensively, her voice cracking. "I just turned my back for a second too long," the woman interrupted, her tone dripping with condescension. "Do you realize the panic your child caused? The entire park was disturbed by his screaming." "That's enough," Elon said, his voice calm but firm as he stepped forward. His presence was commanding, and the woman's eyes flicked to him warily. "This mother doesn't need your judgment right now. She needs support." The woman crossed her arms, her lips curling into a thin, disdainful smile. "Support?" she scoffed. "What she needs is to take responsibility. If she can't manage her child, she shouldn't bring him here." Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered to watch the unfolding drama. Some whispered to one another, clearly uncomfortable with the woman's harshness, while others looked to Elon, wondering how he would respond. Elon's expression didn't change. He crouched slightly, placing himself between the woman and the mother, who was now holding Liam protectively. "This isn't helping anyone," he said evenly. "If you're so concerned about the rules, perhaps you should focus on offering solutions instead of blame." The woman's cheeks flushed with anger, her composure faltering for a moment. "I don't need a lecture from you," she snapped. "You may think you're some kind of hero, stepping in like this, but all you've done is create more chaos." Elon raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. If helping a scared child and his worried mother is chaos, Then perhaps this park could use a little more of it. A few people in the crowd chuckled softly, their tension easing as Elon's words cut through the woman's hostility. But she wasn't done yet. Straightening her blazer, she turned her attention to the mother. "You need to understand," she said coldly, "that this kind of behavior is unacceptable. We have standards in this community, and people like you," she paused, her gaze flicking to Liam's worn sneakers and the fraying edges of the mother's coat, "don't seem to meet them." The mother's face crumpled, her eyes filling with fresh tears. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Elon's jaw tightened slightly, and for the first time, a flicker of anger crossed his usually composed features. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Are you implying that this family doesn't belong here because of how they look?" The woman hesitated, caught off guard by his directness. "I didn't say that," she said defensively. "I'm just pointing out that there are rules." "No," Elon interrupted, his voice cutting through hers like a blade. "What you're pointing out is your own bias. And it's not only unhelpful, it's harmful." The crowd murmured again, this time louder, as more people stepped closer to witness the confrontation. Some nodded in agreement with Elon's words, while others looked uncomfortable, unsure of how to react. The woman's face reddened, her indignation giving way to frustration. "You don't understand how things work here," she said, her voice rising. "We have a responsibility to maintain order, and that means holding people accountable for their actions. And who decides what accountability looks like?" Elon asked, his tone still calm but carrying a quiet intensity. "You, based on your personal opinions about who deserves to be here." The woman's mouth opened and closed, but no response came. Elon continued, his voice steady. "This isn't about rules. It's about empathy." A child was scared, and his mother was trying her best. Instead of offering compassion, you chose to shame her. That says more about you than it does about them. The woman took a step back, her confidence visibly shaken. But she wasn't ready to back down entirely. "You're overstepping," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You have no right to involve yourself in this." Elon straightened, his gaze unwavering. "When someone is being mistreated, everyone has a right to step in. It's called being human." The crowd erupted into quiet applause, their support for Elon evident. The woman looked around, her face growing redder as she realized she was losing the crowd. But instead of retreating, she doubled down. "You may think you're making a difference," she said, her voice sharp, "but all you're doing is encouraging irresponsibility. People like her," she gestured toward the mother, "will never learn if we keep making excuses for them." The mother flinched as though she had been struck. Liam clung to her leg, his small body trembling as he buried his face in her coat. Elon's expression darkened, his patience thinning. "This conversation is over," he said firmly. "You're not helping, and your words are only causing more harm. If you can't offer kindness, then I suggest you step away." The woman opened her mouth to retort, but the weight of the crowd's disapproval finally silenced her. With a huff, she turned on her heel and marched away, her footsteps echoing loudly as she disappeared down the path. The tension lingered, but as Elon knelt once more to speak softly to Liam and his mother, the atmosphere began to shift. The crowd watched in awe, their whispers filled with admiration and curiosity. "What's he going to do next?" someone asked. No one knew, but it was clear that Elon Musk wasn't done yet. As the woman in the blazer stormed off, the tension in the air seemed to shift. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and while many were impressed by Elon Musk's calm intervention, a few still muttered discontentedly. Some couldn't help but side-eye the mother and child, their judgment simmering just beneath the surface. The mother, still clutching Liam tightly, wiped her tears with the back of her hand and looked up at Elon. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she said, "Thank you, I didn't know what to do." Elon offered her a reassuring smile, crouching down to meet Liam's tear-streaked gaze. "It's going to be okay, buddy," he said softly. "You're safe now." But before the moment could settle, a loud, nasally voice sliced through the air. "Oh, here we go again," the voice sneered. The crowd turned to see a heavy-set man in a too-tight polo shirt approaching with an exaggerated swagger. His round face was flushed, and a permanent smirk curled his lips as he eyed the scene before him. He was holding a disposable coffee cup, which he shook mockingly in Elon's direction as he approached. "What's this? Another hero complex in action?" the man jeered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess. You think you're saving the world one crying kid at a time?" Elon stood slowly, his gaze steady and calm, but the man didn't flinch. He was clearly the type who thrived on conflict, feeding off the discomfort of others. "I'm just doing what anyone should do," Elon replied evenly. "Helping someone in need." The man let out a derisive laugh, taking a long sip from his coffee. "Right, because you're some kind of saint," he said, rolling his eyes. "Newsflash, pal, this isn't a movie. Not everyone needs you swooping in to save the day." Elon didn't respond immediately, his silence unsettling the man more than any words could have. But the man wasn't done. He turned his attention to the mother, his expression twisting into one of mock pity. "And you," he said, gesturing toward her with his coffee cup. "What kind of parent are you? Letting your kid scream his head off in the middle of a park? Do you have any idea how annoying that is for the rest of us?" The mother's face flushed with shame, her grip on Liam tightening. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The man smirked, clearly enjoying her discomfort. "People like you," he continued, his voice growing louder, "are the reason places like this go downhill. You show up with your drama, making everyone else deal with your mess. It's pathetic." "That's enough," Elon said, his voice firm but calm. The man turned back to Elon, his smirk widening. "Oh, now the hero wants to play referee," he said mockingly. "You don't even know these people, do you? You're just sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." "I know enough," Elon replied, his gaze unwavering. "Enough to see that you're out of line." The man snorted, crossing his arms over his chest. "Out of line," he repeated, feigning offense. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking. Don't pretend you're any different." Elon tilted his head slightly, studying the man with a calm intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "And what exactly are you accomplishing by tearing people down?" he asked. The man hesitated, caught off guard by the question. But he quickly recovered, plastering a smug grin on his face. "I'm just telling it like it is," he said. "Someone has to." "Or maybe," Elon said, his tone deliberate, "you're just trying to make yourself feel bigger by making others feel smaller." A murmur ran through the crowd, several heads nodding in agreement. The man's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly covered it with a dismissive laugh. "Spare me the psychoanalysis," he said, waving his hand as if brushing off Elon's words. "You don't know me." "No," Elon admitted, his gaze steady. "But your actions speak loud enough." The man's cheeks reddened, his bravado cracking under the weight of the crowd's growing disapproval. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, turning his attention back to the mother. "Look, if you can't handle your kid, maybe you shouldn't be out here in the first place," he said harshly. "There are plenty of places where people like you—" "People like her?" Elon interrupted, his voice sharp and cutting. The man froze, realizing too late the implication of his words. I didn't mean it like that," he stammered, his confidence slipping. "Then what did you mean?" Elon pressed, his calm demeanor now edged with quiet intensity. "Because it sounds a lot like you're making assumptions about someone based on nothing more than your own biases." The crowd fell silent, all eyes on the man as he shifted uncomfortably under Elon's gaze. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came. "That's what I thought," Elon said, his tone firm but measured. He turned back to the mother, his expression softening. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," he said gently. "You're doing your best, and that's enough." The mother's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Thank you." Elon turned back to the man, his gaze steady. "If you have nothing helpful to say," he said, "then I suggest you move on." The man's face flushed a deep red, his confidence thoroughly shattered. With a muttered curse, he turned and stormed off, his coffee cup crushed in his hand. The crowd watched him go, their murmurs of approval for Elon growing louder. But even as the tension began to ease, Elon knew the situation was far from over. The whispers of judgment and discontent lingered in the air, a reminder that change wouldn't come easily. And as he turned back to the mother and child, he felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The murmurs of approval that rippled through the crowd after the heavyset man's exit were short-lived. It wasn't long before another figure emerged, this one far more composed but equally sharp-tongued. A woman in her late 50s, dressed in tailored slacks and an oversized sun hat, stepped forward. Her expression was carefully neutral, but the tight line of her lips betrayed her irritation. She clutched a designer toad in one hand and a small, impeccably groomed poodle in the other, the dog yipping as if echoing her discontent. "Excuse me," she began, her tone clipped and authoritative. "But I think this little situation has gone on long enough." Elon turned to face her, his calm expression unchanging. "What do you mean?" he asked evenly. The woman gestured broadly toward the playground, her perfectly manicured nails catching the sunlight. "This entire spectacle," she said, "it's completely disruptive. I bring my dog to this park for a peaceful stroll, not to witness a scene straight out of a soap opera." Several onlookers bristled at her words, but no one dared to speak up. Elon, however, remained unfazed. "A child was scared and looking for his mother," he said. "That's hardly a spectacle. It's a situation that needed compassion and understanding." "Compassion?" the woman repeated, her lips curving into a faint sneer. "Is that what you call it? From where I'm standing, it looks more like unnecessary drama. If the mother had been paying attention to her child in the first place, none of this would have happened." The mother, still holding Liam protectively, flinched as though the words had physically struck her. Her face reddened, and she averted her eyes, unable to meet the woman's gaze. "That's enough," Elon said firmly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made the woman pause. "This mother doesn't need to be shamed for a moment of human error. She needs support, not judgment." The woman's eyes narrowed, her grip on the poodle tightening. "Support?" she echoed, her tone dripping with disdain. "Is that what we're calling it now? Making excuses for people who can't even manage the basic responsibility of watching their own child." A ripple of discomfort passed through the crowd. Some whispered to one another, clearly disapproving of the woman's harshness, while others remained silent, their expressions conflicted. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second. Elon took a small step forward, his calm gaze locking onto the woman's. "Everyone makes mistakes," he said, his tone measured. "But the real mistake here is choosing to tear someone down when you could just as easily lift them up." The woman let out a soft, derisive laugh. "How noble," she said, her eyes narrowing. "But let me ask you this, what happens when we lower our standards for people who can't keep up? What happens when we allow carelessness to become the norm?" "This isn't about lowering standards," Elon replied. "It's about recognizing that compassion and accountability aren't mutually exclusive. You can hold someone accountable without demeaning them." The woman arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "That sounds lovely in theory," she said. "But in practice, it's people like her," she gestured toward the mother with a flick of her wrist, "who make life harder for the rest of us. If she can't handle her responsibilities, why should the rest of us have to pick up the slack?" The mother's eyes filled with tears, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Liam, sensing her distress, clung to her leg, his small hands gripping her jeans tightly. Elon's jaw tightened slightly, a flicker of frustration crossing his otherwise composed features. "You talk about responsibilities," he said, his voice steady but edged with quiet intensity. "But what about your responsibility as a member of this community? Isn't it your responsibility to show empathy and understanding to those who need it?" The woman's expression hardened, her posture stiffening. "Empathy is earned," she said coolly. "And quite frankly, I don't see why I should waste mine on someone who can't even be bothered to keep track of her own child." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd, growing louder as more people stepped forward to show their support for the mother. A young man in a hoodie spoke up, his voice shaky but determined. You don't know her situation, he said. You're just making assumptions. The woman turned her icy gaze on him, her lips curving into a faint sneer. And what, pray tell, do you know about her situation? She asked. Are you her spokesperson now? I don't have to know her situation to know that what you're doing is wrong. The young man shot back. You're just kicking someone when they're already down. Elon stepped forward again, his calm presence silencing the murmurs around him. It's easy to judge from a distance, he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that demanded attention. But real strength comes from stepping closer and offering help. The woman opened her mouth to respond, but Elon wasn't finished. If you're so concerned about standards, he continued, then maybe it's time to raise yours. Starting with how you treat people. The crowd erupted into quiet applause, their support for Elon evident. The woman's face reddened, and she looked around, clearly uncomfortable with the growing disapproval. But instead of backing down, she crossed her arms and let out a huff. This park used to be a peaceful place, she muttered. Now it's just chaos. Elon tilted his head slightly, studying her with a calm intensity that made her shift uncomfortably. Chaos isn't the problem, he said. It's how we respond to it that matters. The park had shifted into an uneasy hum of quiet conversations and stolen glances as Elon crouched beside the mother, offering her a reassuring nod. Liam clung to her tightly, his small fingers still gripping the fabric of her jeans, his tear-streaked face buried against her leg. It seemed, for a moment, that the tension was beginning to dissipate, but the atmosphere remained charged, like a storm waiting to break. As Elon opened his mouth to speak, another figure stepped forward from the crowd. He was tall and wiry, with a sharp nose and a permanent sneer that seemed etched into his face. His clothes were pristine, a crisp, button-down shirt and neatly pressed slacks, and his leather shoes clicked against the pavement as he approached. The man had the air of someone who had never doubted his own importance a day in his life. Well, he drawled, his voice loud enough to carry over the hushed murmurs. What do we have here? A knight in shining armor come to rescue the damsel in distress. Elon straightened slowly, his calm gaze meeting the man's smug expression. I'm just helping someone who needed it, he said simply. The man let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Helping? He repeated, his tone dripping with mockery. Is that what you're calling it? From where I'm standing, it looks more like meddling. Elon's expression didn't waver. And from where I'm standing, he said, it looks like you've decided to involve yourself in something that doesn't concern you. The man's smirk widened, his confidence seemingly unshaken. Oh, but it does concern me, he said. You see, I come to this park every day. I pay my taxes. I have a right to enjoy this space without being subjected to this nonsense. He gestured broadly toward the mother and Liam, his dismissive wave cutting through the air like a knife. The mother flinched, her shoulders hunching as though she could physically shield herself from his words. This nonsense, Elon said evenly, is a mother trying to comfort her child. If that bothers you, perhaps you should take a closer look at your priorities. The man's smirk faltered for the briefest of moments, but he quickly recovered, crossing his arms over his chest. My priorities, he said, include keeping this park a respectable place. And right now, it's anything but. The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement while others exchanged uneasy glances. The man seemed to feed off the mixed reactions, his confidence growing as he turned his attention back to the mother. Look, he said, his tone taking on a mockingly conciliatory edge. I get it. Kids cry. It happens. But maybe, just maybe, if you can't keep your child under control, you should consider staying home until you can. The mother's face crumpled, fresh tears welling in her eyes. Liam whimpered softly, his small hands tightening their grip on her jeans. Elon's jaw tightened, the flicker of frustration from earlier now simmering just beneath the surface. That's enough, he said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable edge. This woman doesn't owe you, or anyone else, an explanation for her presence here. She has every right to be in this park. The man arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. And what about the rest of us? He demanded. What about our right to enjoy this space without having to deal with someone else's problems? Your rights don't supersede hers, Elon replied, his tone calm but firm. This park is for everyone, not just the people you deem acceptable. The man's sneer deepened, his frustration bubbling to the surface. You think you're so clever, he said, his voice rising. Coming in here with your calm demeanor and your big speeches. But you don't know anything about me or this park. I know enough, Elon said simply. Enough to see that your words are doing more harm than good. The man's face reddened, and he took a step closer, his finger jabbing toward Elon's chest. You don't get to tell me how to feel, he snapped. I have a right to speak my mind, and if that makes someone uncomfortable, that's their problem. Elon didn't flinch, his steady gaze meeting the man's glare. You're right, he said. You do have the right to speak your mind. But with that right comes a responsibility to consider the impact of your words. And right now, your words are causing more harm than good. The man let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. Spare me the lecture, he said. People like you always think you're better than everyone else, swooping in to save the day like you're some kind of hero. This isn't about being a hero, Elon replied. It's about being human. The crowd murmured again, their whispers growing louder as more people stepped forward to show their support for Elon. The man looked around, his confidence faltering as he realized the tide was turning against him. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his voice rising in frustration. You don't belong here, he spat, his words directed at the mother and Liam. You're dragging this park down, and people like you, people like her? Elon interrupted, his voice sharp and cutting. The man hesitated, caught off guard by the question. I didn't mean, he began, but Elon didn't let him finish. No, I think you did mean it, Elon said, his tone deliberate. And that says a lot more about you than it does about her. The crowd erupted into quiet applause, their support for Elon evident. The man's face reddened, and he looked around, clearly uncomfortable with the growing disapproval. But instead of retreating, he straightened his posture, his jaw tightening as he glared at Elon. You think you're better than me, he said, his voice low and filled with venom. But you're just as arrogant as the rest of them. Elon tilted his head slightly, studying the man with a calm intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. This isn't about me, he said simply. It's about how we treat each other. And right now, you're treating this mother and her child in a way that's unacceptable. The atmosphere in the park had shifted. Though the man with the sneer had retreated, the air was still thick with tension. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and more bystanders gathered to witness the unfolding drama. Some had their phones out, capturing the moment on camera, while others exchanged nervous glances. It was clear that this situation had become more than just a crying child. It had turned into a flashpoint for everyone's opinions, biases, and frustrations. Elon remained by the mother's side, his calm demeanor never faltering, though his eyes scanned the crowd with quiet intensity. He knew the confrontation wasn't over, and he was right. From the back of the crowd emerged a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark jacket, his booming voice cutting through the murmurs. All right, enough of this nonsense, he barked, striding toward Elon and the mother. His presence commanded attention, and the crowd parted to let him through. The man stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms over his chest as he surveyed the scene with a look of disdain. So, what's the big deal here? He demanded. Why is everyone standing around like it's a circus? Elon straightened, meeting the man's gaze. A child was lost and scared, he said evenly. We were helping him find his mother. The man snorted, shaking his head. Helping? He repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Looks to me like you're just stirring up trouble. Elon's expression remained calm. Trouble? He asked. What trouble do you see in helping a child? The kind of trouble, the man said, stepping closer, where people like you think you can just swoop in and take over. You think you're better than everyone else, don't you? I think doing the right thing is better than standing by and doing nothing, Elon replied. The man's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. And who made you the authority on what's right? He snapped. You come here, acting like you own the place, But you don't know a thing about this community. I know enough, Elon said. Enough to see that a scared child and his mother don't deserve the judgment and hostility they've been given. The man's face reddened, his frustration boiling over. Judgment? Hostility? He barked. You don't get it, do you? People like her. He jabbed a finger toward the mother. Make it harder for the rest of us. They bring their problems here and expect everyone else to deal with them. The mother flinched at his words, her face crumpling as fresh tears filled her eyes. Liam clung to her leg, his small body trembling. That's enough, Elon said, his voice cutting through the man's tirade like a blade. You don't know her story. You don't know what she's been through. And I don't care, the man shot back. She's not my problem. None of this is my problem. That's where you're wrong, Elon said, his tone calm but firm. We're all part of this community, whether you like it or not. And being part of a community means looking out for one another. The man let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. Spare me the lecture, he said. You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a self-righteous busybody sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Elon took a step closer, his gaze steady. If standing up for what's right makes me a busybody, then so be it. The man's face twisted with anger, his fists clenching at his sides. You don't belong here, he spat. People like you come in, thinking you can change everything. But all you do is make things worse. People like me? Elon asked, his voice steady. Or people who are willing to speak up when they see something wrong? The man didn't answer, his frustration evident in the way his jaw worked. Elon continued, his tone unyielding. The real problem here isn't the mother or her child. It's the lack of empathy from people like you. The crowd murmured in agreement, their whispers growing louder as more people stepped forward to show their support for Elon. The man's confidence faltered, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. You think you're so much better than me, he said, his voice low and venomous. But you're just another rich guy who doesn't understand how the real world works. Elon tilted his head slightly, studying the man with a calm intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. You're right, he said finally. I am fortunate, but that doesn't mean I don't understand struggle. And it doesn't mean I'm any less responsible for helping others. The man opened his mouth to respond, but Elon wasn't finished. True strength isn't about tearing people down, he said. It's about lifting them up. And right now you have a choice. You can keep trying to tear this family down, or you can choose to be better. The crowd erupted into applause, their support for Elon loud and clear. The man looked around, his face reddening as he realized he had lost the crowd. But instead of retreating, he glared at Elon, his fists clenched at his sides. You think you've won? He spat. This isn't over. Elon didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. It's over when you decide to stop, he said simply. The man stared at him for a long moment before finally turning on his heel and storming off, his shoulders stiff with anger. The crowd watched him go, their murmurs of disapproval fading as they turned their attention back to Elon. The mother let out a shaky breath, her eyes filled with gratitude as she looked at Elon. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know what I would have done without you. Elon crouched beside her, his calm demeanor softening. You're stronger than you think, he said gently. And you don't have to face this alone. The man hadn't made it far. Though he'd stormed off in a flurry of anger and embarrassment, he lingered just outside the crowd, pacing furiously along the edge of the playground. It was clear he wasn't done. His indignation boiled over, and his muttered words reached those nearest to him. I've had enough of this nonsense, he growled, throwing his arms up dramatically. Who does he think he is? Elon Musk, of all people, telling me how to live my life? The audacity! A few parkgoers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared approach him. His temper was volcanic, and the heat of his fury seemed to radiate outward, keeping everyone at a safe distance. The man finally spun on his heel and marched back into the fray, his presence a looming shadow over the atmosphere. All right, he barked, pointing a finger directly at Elon. If you're so high and mighty, let's see you answer this. What gives you the right to stand there and act like you're better than me? You don't live here. You don't know these people. You're just a billionaire playing savior because it makes you feel good." The crowd bristled, their whispers growing louder. Elon turned to face the man, his calm demeanor unshaken. "This isn't about being better than anyone," he said evenly. "It's about doing what's right." The man laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and grating. "Doing what's right?" he echoed, spoken like someone who's never had to struggle a day in his life. "You think it's easy to show compassion when you're living in your ivory tower?" Elon stepped forward, closing the space between them. His presence was steady, unflinching, and the man's confidence began to falter under his unwavering gaze. "You're right about one thing," Elon said. "I am fortunate. I've had opportunities that many people don't. But that's exactly why I'm here. Because it's not enough to stand by and watch when you have the power to make a difference." The man's face reddened, but he didn't back down. "Spare me the speech," he snapped. "You're just another rich guy trying to buy people's approval." "I'm not here for approval," Elon replied, his tone calm but firm. "I'm here because this mother and her child deserve better than the way you've treated them." The crowd erupted into applause, their support for Elon loud and clear. The man's confidence cracked, and he glanced around, realizing just how outnumbered he was. But instead of retreating, he crossed his arms and sneered. "Fine," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "Let's say you're right. Let's say I've been too harsh. What does that change? You can't fix people like her. They're always going to be a burden on society." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, and all eyes turned to Elon. His expression didn't waver, but there was a quiet intensity in his gaze that made the man take an involuntary step back. "People like her?" Elon repeated, his voice steady but edged with quiet fury. "You mean people who are doing their best in a world that often sets them up to fail? People who deserve kindness and understanding, not judgment and cruelty?" The man hesitated, his bravado faltering. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," Elon said, cutting him off. "And that says more about you than it does about her." The man opened his mouth to respond, but Elon didn't give him the chance. "Your words have power," he continued, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "And you've used that power to tear someone down instead of lifting them up. That's not strength. That's weakness." The man's face turned a deep shade of red, and he clenched his fists at his sides. He glanced around the crowd, searching for support, but the faces staring back at him were filled with disapproval. Even those who had been silent earlier now shook their heads, their disgust evident. Elon stepped closer, his gaze never leaving the man's. "You had a choice," he said. "You could have chosen empathy. You could have chosen to help. But instead, you chose to judge. And now you're standing here, trying to justify your behavior instead of taking responsibility for it." The man's shoulders slumped slightly, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Elon's words. He looked down, avoiding Elon's gaze, but the crowd's murmurs of agreement filled the silence. "Let me ask you something," Elon said, his voice softer but no less firm. "What are you so afraid of?" The man's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. "What?" he said, his voice shaky. "You've spent all this time tearing others down," Elon continued. "Why? What are you trying to protect? Your pride? Your sense of control?" The man stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For the first time, he had no response. The crowd watched in silence, their eyes shifting between Elon and the man as the weight of the moment settled over them. "You don't have to answer me," Elon said finally. "But I hope you take the time to answer yourself. Because until you do, you'll keep hurting others. And yourself." The man's face crumpled, and he turned on his heel, his steps heavy as he walked away. This time, no one stopped him. The crowd parted silently to let him pass, their disapproval evident in their expressions. As the man disappeared from view, the tension in the park began to ease. The crowd turned their attention back to Elon, their admiration and gratitude palpable. The mother wiped her tears, her voice trembling as she said, "Thank you for everything." Elon crouched beside her, his calm presence a steadying force. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," he said gently. You're stronger than you think. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their support for Elon clear. But even as the atmosphere shifted, Elon knew there was still work to be done. The man's humiliation had been a necessary step, but it was only the beginning of a larger conversation. And Elon was ready to lead it. Elon turned his attention back to the boy, his expression softening. "Hey, buddy," he said gently, kneeling down to meet Liam's eyes. "It's been a rough day, hasn't it?" Liam sniffled and nodded, his grip on his mother's hand tightening. Elon reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. It bore the logo of one of his foundations, a program aimed at supporting families in need. "This is for you and your mom," he said, handing the card to the boy. "There's a number on here. If you ever need anything, food, housing, education, you call that number." "Okay." The mother's eyes widened, her hand trembling as she reached for the card. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Thank you doesn't feel like enough." "You don't have to say anything," Elon replied with a warm smile. "Just know that you're not alone." The mother's tears returned, but this time they were tears of gratitude. She clutched the card to her chest, her voice trembling as she said, "I'll never forget this." "Thank you." Elon nodded, his attention briefly shifting to the crowd. The remaining onlookers had begun to murmur amongst themselves, many of them casting admiring glances in his direction. But Elon wasn't one for grandstanding. He stood and addressed the group, his voice calm but purposeful. "We all have moments when we struggle," he began, his words carrying over the quiet chatter. "Moments when we feel overwhelmed, when life throws us challenges we don't know how to face. And in those moments, what we need most isn't judgment or criticism. It's compassion." The crowd grew silent, every eye fixed on him as he continued. "What happened here today is a reminder of how powerful our words and actions can be. They can tear people down or they can lift them up. The choice is ours." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, and Elon's gaze swept across the faces before him. "It's easy to point fingers," he said, "to blame others for their struggles without knowing the full story. But if we take the time to listen, to understand, we might find that we're more alike than we realize." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. "We have the power to make a difference," he said finally. "Not just in big ways, but in the small, everyday choices we make. Choosing kindness over judgment, empathy over indifference. That's how we create a better world." The applause that followed was quiet at first, then grew into a wave of approval that echoed through the park. Elon nodded in acknowledgement but didn't linger in the spotlight. Instead, he turned back to the mother and Liam, crouching down once more. "You're going to be okay," he said softly, his words meant for them alone. "And if you ever need help, don't hesitate to reach out." The mother nodded, her voice trembling as she said, "Thank you for everything." Elon stood and took a step back, his presence still commanding but no longer the center of attention. The crowd began to disperse, their murmurs of admiration and reflection carrying on the breeze. But the memory of what had happened here would linger long after they'd gone. How many times have we witnessed someone in need and hesitated to act? How often do we choose silence because it feels safer than speaking out? Elon's actions in this story remind us that we all have the power to make a difference, no matter how small it may seem. But this story also serves as a cautionary tale. The antagonists in this park weren't inherently bad people. They were products of their own fears and insecurities, lashing out at others because it was easier than looking inward. And while their behavior was unacceptable, it's a reminder for all of us to examine our own actions. Are we building people up, or are we tearing them down? Are we choosing empathy, or are we letting our biases cloud our judgment? For those of you watching, ask yourself, what would you have done in this situation? Would you have stepped forward like Elon, or would you have stayed silent in the background? It's not an easy question to answer, but it's one worth considering. And for those of you who might be struggling right now, whether it's as a parent trying to make ends meet, or as someone dealing with judgment from others, know this: you are not alone. There are people who care, who are willing to help, and who see your worth even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. So as you go about your day, take a moment to look around. There's always someone who could use a kind word, a helping hand, or just a little understanding. Be the person who makes a difference, even in the smallest of ways. Because, as this story shows, those small moments can have a ripple effect that changes lives. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this one. And remember, kindness is contagious. Let's spread it together.